You know, despite most of them being commercial failures, I've had a fondness for Sega consoles. I've always been a fan of the Saturn, Dreamcast, and yes, of course, the Genesis. I don't know, there's just something about these consoles that was very appealing to me. Sure, they sold like shit, but they were my shit. Yeah, Sega consoles didn't last long. After the Dreamcast was released in 1998, it was clear that Sega was done with consoles, and they would then transition to going completely third-party. I mean, you know what they say, if you can't beat them, join them. Given this information, it's probably no surprise that a few Sega consoles were prototyped, but never saw the light of day. It turns out that Sega wanted to have an even bigger presence in the gaming console market. I mean, yeah, no kidding. There were a total of 3 different Sega consoles that were planned to be released, but never got past the prototype stages for varying reasons. So let's talk about them. First up, we got the Sega Neptune, which is by far the most infamous canceled Sega console. But before we talk about that, I think it's important we briefly talk about the Sega CDX. This console was a hybrid of the Sega Genesis and the Sega CD, and was produced ultimately to increase sales along with cutting costs. While the Sega CD was a cool add-on, it was very clunky and it took up a ton of space. Not to mention that it needed a second AC adapter to function. Yikes. So this made a lot of sense. Unfortunately, nowadays you would still be better off purchasing a Genesis and Sega CD combo because, yeah. Now, the Sega Neptune set out to do something very similar, but instead of combining this and this, the Neptune would have combined this and this. The 32X was another pretty cool add-on for the Genesis, but it was just so damn expensive. So Sega wanted to make a Genesis and 32X hybrid to offer a budget way to experience 32-bit gaming. Since, again, the 32X and Sega Saturn were pretty expensive. Just kidding. Yeah, since they were planning on launching this thing in 1995, which was after the launch of the Sega Saturn, Sega decided to scrap the project altogether because they were afraid that there would be low interest due to the release of the Sega Saturn. What? I thought the whole point of this thing was to be a budget option for people who didn't want to buy a Saturn. Even if that weren't the case, Neptune's purpose wouldn't have been entirely defeated. The Saturn wasn't backwards compatible with Genesis or 32X games, so it still would have been nice to have a budget option to play those games. On the other hand though, I can kinda see their thought process here. Naturally, they would have wanted people to buy the more expensive 32-bit console instead of the cheaper one, even if one was very underpowered compared to the other. But you get what I mean, the average consumer doesn't pay attention to that stuff. I think a console that combined the Genesis, 32X, and Sega CD would have been much better, but I could only imagine how much that would have cost to produce. But I mean, come on now, look at this. This shit takes 3 different power adapters. That's damn near a fire hazard. Discussion involving the Neptune didn't stop after its cancellation, however. In April of 2001, the Electronic Gaming Monthly magazine stated that prototypes of the Sega Neptune were found and put up for sale to the public. That was a lie. This was just an April Fool's joke, but it did spark a lot of interest in the console. Fast forward to last month, yeah, this saga is still going to this day. In late June, it was announced that a company called GamesCare would be releasing a recreation of the Sega Neptune in Brazil, titled the GF1 Neptune, and it will also be compatible with the Sega CD. That's fucking awesome. It is so cool to me how we are now going to be able to get a taste of what the Sega Neptune was all about so many years later. Even though, at the end of the day, it will basically just be a slightly different Genesis with 32X compatibility built in. But it's still awesome to see this lost piece of Sega history finally restored. Next up, we have the Sega Jupiter. Man, they really like these planet names, don't they? To understand this one, we gotta take a little history lesson. You ever wonder why the Sega Saturn has a cartridge slot on it? Before I bought one, I thought it was for backwards compatibility with Genesis games, but it turns out this slot was just used for memory expansion and action replay stuff. However, at one point in time, Sega wanted to continue producing cartridge-based games for the Sega Saturn. For some f***ing reason. Yeah, this made no sense because discs were and still are way cheaper to produce. So Sega said f*** it and still left the slot on the Saturn. I mean, thankfully it had some use, but come on, it would have been awesome if you were able to play Genesis games on the Saturn. Anyway, where does the Sega Jupiter come in? Well, this thing was rumored to be a Sega Saturn, but without a disc drive. Yeah, it's pretty clear as to why this thing was scrapped. What's the point of producing a console without a disc drive if discs were the only way the thing was able to play games? Unlike the Neptune, no prototypes were ever made for the Jupiter, so this thing has just faded into obscurity, and it's unclear if we will ever know more about it. But given what we know about it at the moment, this thing was pointless. Let's move on. The Sega Pluto. Okay, now we're filling the whole damn solar system. The Pluto was supposed to be yet another revision of the Sega Saturn, commonly dubbed the Sega Saturn II. We didn't learn about this thing until 2013, when a former Sega employee leaked everything online. Awesome, now someone leaked the Frontiers beta. With this leak, we also got to see prototypes prototypes for the console, featuring a wider and slimmer design compared to the base model. Oh, but that's not all. Another prototype was found at a flea market in California for $3. The buyer then put it up for auction and it got up to almost $8,000. Holy shit. Both prototypes were pretty much the same, with some very minor differences, like the logos being placed in different spots. But yeah, they're the same thing pretty much. The idea of this thing was basically to be a Sega Saturn with a built-in hard drive and netlink adapter. If released, this would have been one of the first consoles ever to have internet built into the unit. The netlink adapter was used to play games like Duke Nukem 3D and Daytona USA, along with a few others. However, due to the small selection of games that supported the adapter, it's obvious why the Pluto was cancelled. Yeah, it's cool that the device was built in out of the box, but why put in the effort if barely anything supported it? It was pointless. And honestly, that's why pretty much all of these consoles were cancelled in the first place. They were all hardware revisions that didn't serve any purpose. All of the additional features added to the consoles were cool, but there was no point to them in the long run, due to low interest or just outdated specs. But there you have it. Those are the cancelled Sega consoles. I really hope you all enjoyed this video, and let me know what you all think about these consoles in the comments down below. But thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all later. Goodbye.